So I've been slogging through a series of pretty mid-reads recently. Nothing terrible, mind you, nothing that threw me into a reading tailspin or that dreaded reading slump. Just things that I didn't fully engage with, and not for lack of trying either. I think I even reread one of the books, pretty certain that it was going to rise in my estimation with a closer reading, that the problem was clearly me and not the book. It was the book. And so I have to say, it is not without a little bit of gratitude that I finally got around to reading Celeste Ng's Our Missing Hearts, because this thing just hit right. And it was never really a question of if I was going to read this book. It was more a matter of when. I think Celeste Ng is like Emily St. John Mandel. Reasonably prolific and consistently good. I think I came to that realization after reading Emily St. John Mandel's Sea of Tranquility, after finishing Glass Hotel and Station 11. All books I liked. And at that point, I realized Emily St. John Mandel is like flan. Not your favorite dessert of all time, not the thing that you crave at 2 a.m. in the morning, but solidly, reasonably, consistently good. Emily St. John Mandel and flan. Pretty darn good. Faint praise, I suppose, but there's something to be said about being consistently good. Most authors would kill to be consistently good, to say nothing about posting the numbers that Emily St. John Mandel has. And Celeste, also pretty consistently good. I loved Everything I Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere, but I gotta say, Our Missing Hearts hits different. Maybe it's becoming off a series of mid-reads, and maybe it's that case where you find the perfect book at the perfect time, but I gotta say, I loved this book. So let's get into it. We've got 12-year-old Noah Gardner who lives alone with his dad. His dad is a quiet, bookish sort, loves words, keeps his head down, mostly keeps to himself, reshelving books at the university library, at a university somewhere in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So they live in a single-bedroom apartment on the 10th story of a dorm building on the campus of that same university. It's a building where the elevators don't work. The room has a small two-burner stove, a fridge barely big enough to hold up a carton of milk. There's no AC in the summertime, and in the wintertime the radiator rattles and clicks. But one day, Noah, he gets this letter, and it's got nothing in it but a single sheet of paper that's filled from edge to edge with pictures of cats. Little cats, big cats, tuxedo, calico, striped cats, cats sitting upright, licking their paws, lolling in puddles of sunlight. Edge to edge. On the other side, the page is completely blank. And the letter is addressed to Bird. It's a name that Noah has given himself, that he hasn't used in years. And this makes him certain that this is a letter from his mother, who he hasn't seen in over 3 years. It's the first little breadcrumb that will lead Noah on a classic hero's journey. He will have to leave the familiar behind and embark bravely into the unknown, into a world beset with dangers, scattered clues, and unlikely allies. It is a modern-day fairy tale, perfect bookish catnip. And Noah is at that age where he hasn't completely given up hope. He hasn't given in to cynicism, and instead is ready to tackle this adventure with the right amount of wide-eyed wonder, hope, and optimism. And in the right hands, in Celeste Ng's hands, it can be an incredible thing to read with just the right amount of heartstring pulling. But let's add another layer. Noah's living 10 years past what was often referred to as the capital C crisis. It was a worldwide economic breakdown, skyrocketing unemployment, massive rising rents, huge evictions, shortages everywhere, lots of unrest leading to protests and ultimately riots. And people needed something or someone to blame. A way to make sense of how things had gotten this bad. A cohesive narrative that explained away how everything had failed so miserably. And China seemed like an easy target. Their GDP kept rising. Their standard of living kept climbing. Hawkish U.S. senators began referring to it as the China crisis, and they angrily noticed how Chinese rice farmers were walking around using smartphones while good old-fashioned Americans were using bucket toilets because their water had been shut off, and it wasn't right. China clearly trying to dismantle the United States from within, targeting it with imposing tariffs, manipulating markets, and just trying to destroy the American way of life. It was the old yellow peril, those foreign faces with their foreign names trying to spoil everything. This simmering xenophobia ultimately comes to a head, and so something called PACT, or the Preservation of American Culture and Traditions, is enacted into law. This is to protect God-fearing Americans from subversive elements that would otherwise grow like a creeping cancer and take over American values. So, PACT funds neighborhood protection groups, bans books, rewards citizen vigilance, people informing on troublemakers, anything that is un-American, and eventually that finds children and removing them from un-American environments. Politically subversive parents can have their children replaced, given new names, and sent to foster families in distant states so they can learn true American values. Now, these replacements tend to target people of Asian origin, or POWs, Kung POWs as they become to be known, which you gotta admit, pretty catchy. The thing is, Noah's mom, Margaret Mew, is the daughter of Chinese immigrants. She's a poet of little renown, but her poem has become the rallying cry at anti-PACT protest. Her book of poetry is found in the dorm room of a young student who is tragically killed when a stray bullet hits her, shot from a police officer trying to quell one of these riotous protests. Margaret Mew clearly inciting un-American behaviors. This tragic accident completely avoidable if not for her subversive writing. And so Noah's mom leaves the family to save them, to ensure that Noah could be raised by at least one biological parent instead of taken away and replaced into some distant foster family. In turn, Noah's dad has to turn his back on his wife, renounce her un-American ways, express relief that he can now raise his son unfettered by these dissident vices and raise him the good old-fashioned American way. He burns all her possessions and never speaks of her again. And here, the dark forest of the fairy tale becomes frighteningly familiar. Here in Canada, we're still wrestling with the legacy of residential schools, Indigenous children taken from their families to be raised correctly in God's faith. And this wasn't ancient history. We are still digging up mass graves at old residential school sites. And the last residential school was just closed 25 years ago in 1996. And this growing xenophobia is simply the water that we're swimming in. 2022 surveys from the Asian American Foundation found that 1 in 3 Americans believe that Asian Americans have more loyalty to their home country than the United States. Asian Americans, 1 in 10, have reported being spit or coughed on in the last year. 1 in 3 report being told to go back to their countries. And surveys found that Asian Americans are essentially invisible in the American imagination. 58% of Americans can't name a single prominent Asian American, not one. And all this while Chinese balloons are being shot down and security concerns abound over TikTok. So yeah, Our Missing Hearts joins a growing list of dystopian novels set 10 seconds in the future. I'm thinking about a novel I read recently called Anthem by Noah Hawley, which is also set in the worst possible timeline, which turns out to be just a lightly fictionalized version of current events. Now, this dystopia didn't work quite as well for me because it was completely soaked in bro pop culture. Imagine a movie written by George Lucas, channeling Chuck Palahniuk as directed by Zack Snyder. And yeah, I'd probably go to the theater to see it, but you gotta admit, it would probably be the worst. And a good novel it does not make. Now, with Our Missing Hearts, also set in the near future, another thing I realized is that with dystopia, it's usually not evenly distributed. Sure, it's a ring of hell for Noah and those families whose children have been displaced, but for the vast swath of Americans, life goes on. They're moving on post-crisis. They're out there, walking the dog, going to school, heading off to work, living in their white picket fenced homes, having dinner together, and vacationing off in Disney World. They all agree that sacrifices have to be made, but that's the price you have to pay for moving on, for putting the past behind you and getting back to that can-do American spirit. And I know I've talked a lot about this, but I want you to know this isn't an Asian American author exposing her trauma and invoking white liberals to wake up and smell the coffee. This isn't a bowl of moral Wheaties. It's not about pointing the finger and making you feel bad. Hashtag stop Asian hate. It is, if anything, without spoiling things, about the impact a single individual can have. And I have to say, I'm grateful for the author's note at the back of the book that pointed me to a 1978 essay called The Power of the Powerless from Václav Havel, which, for Celeste Ng, changed her mind about the impact an individual can have against the long-established system. If nothing else, you should go check out this essay. It's available online. I'll have a link down below. Seriously, go read it. It is not going to make sense of the existential dread of living in this particular world right now, but it will widen your lens a little bit, and I can't recommend it enough. Seriously, go check the essay out, and go read Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng, which I also absolutely loved. All right, that's it for me this week. I thought we were having spring here in Southern Ontario, and then suddenly winter came back with a vengeance. I don't know. We'll see what happens. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week of reading, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.